We've been talking about a lot of the problems in the world associated with climate change, and now we want to start focusing on some of the detail and possibly recognizing a little bit of opportunity. But before we get to this, we've got to take a look at the measurement of energy. We're going to focus on the unit, the BTU, the British Thermal Unit. The British Thermal Unit is the amount of energy needed to heat 1 pound of water by 1 degree Fahrenheit. It's a relatively small unit. It's equivalent to about a match. But when we quantify these things into a building, we get into hundreds of thousands of BTUs. And when we get into large areas, communities, we could get into millions of BTUs. And when we get into cities, we get into much, much larger units. And we're working up to a global scale in the measurement of energy. And to get to that discussion, we need to start talking about quadrillion BTUs, quads. How big is a quadrillion BTUs? Let's take a closer look at maybe some equivalent energy sources. Quadrillion BTUs, or a quad, is equal to the amount of energy in 45 million tons of coal. That's a lot of coal. Well, if we think about natural gas and we look at things like the Aliso Canyon gas leak in October of 2016, which we'll talk about at some point down the road, there was a lot of natural gas that was vented to the air. So we could think about a quad in terms of 1 trillion cubic feet of natural gas. Still kind of hard to get your arms around those quantities. So how about barrels of crude oil? A quad is equal to about 170 million barrels of crude oil. This is a lot of energy. When we look at global consumption of energy, this is an annual number, and this slide is about 5 years old now, but in 2012, the world energy consumption was 542 quads. If you break that down into the sources of energy, we've got to generate the electricity somehow. In most cases, we're using fossil fuels. So fossil fuels account for 452 of those quads, so a great majority. And with those come associated CO2 emissions. Smaller amount, there are 42 quads associated with hydroelectric power, which don't have any CO2 emissions. Sun, wind, and biomass, which don't have any CO2 emissions, 19 quads there. And then there are 437 power plants, nuclear-powered plants around the world, and that accounts for 30 of the quads in the 542. So this is a lot of energy, and the appetite for energy around the world is growing. So what we need to be aware of as we produce energy, in many cases, if it's fossil fuels, we're associating CO2 emissions with that energy.